Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, Sam mentioned we had this session with you, with some of you, and I recognize some familiar faces, so it's great to see you. It's so much different in person, though, and there's so many more of you, so we're really excited to be back with you today, and excited to have a couple folks from our team here today, too. So, my name is Matt Warren. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Harbor Christian Counseling, and just to tell you just really briefly about who we are a Christian counseling group that's based out of Boston, but we serve clients all over Massachusetts. And our mission is to provide biblically informed, gospel-driven, and clinically skilled counseling services for individuals and couples and kids and families. But a big part of our work is also to come alongside churches and church leaders to encourage them and equip them so that they can better care for mental health issues in their own context. So that is what gets us really excited to be here, excited that you all are here to learn about this, and we're just grateful for the opportunity. And thanks to Sam and the whole committee for inviting us to join you today. So I'm just curious real quick, how many in the room here are from Massachusetts? Can you raise your hand? Okay, that's probably the winning state. How many from, just numbers-wise, not best state? How many are from New Hampshire? A couple, okay. Maine? Okay, a couple Mainers. Connecticut? Okay. Rhode Island? One. Way to go, way to be. Did I miss any states? Vermont. How many from Vermont? I'm so sorry about that. But there's none here, so that's all good, yeah. What's that about? Where are you, Vermont? I'm from Texas, by the way, but I've been in Massachusetts for 11 years now, so I feel like an adopted New Englander at this point. Well, crisis, you see is in the title here. Crisis is something that we hear a lot about these days, isn't it? Financial crises, political crises, moral crises. Sometimes things that feel like a crisis aren't actually crises on that same level. For instance, this past summer, I had a raccoon crisis at my house. If you've ever had raccoons, it is a crisis. But I was trying to plant some grass in my backyard, and every night, this frustrating group of 3 or 4 raccoons would break into my backyard, rip up all the grass, and I could not stop them. I tried spray, I tried fences, I tried netting, I tried physical intimidation. I had a stare down with a raccoon. He was not afraid of me at all. I couldn't figure out any way to solve this crisis, but time just had to pass, and they moved on, found something more interesting. Of course, some crises are much more serious than this, though, right? They involve the lives and the well-being of people we care deeply about. For you all as church leaders, they affect the congregations that you are serving and shepherding. This past January, the CDC released a summary report for a decade-long project called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is some findings from it. You don't need to be able to see it. I know it's very small. But this report captured several areas of interest, including adolescent mental health, and the results were quite alarming. You can see the left one there. It indicates that 29% of high school students reported poor mental health within the past 30-day span. And the highest prevalence of that, really significantly highest, is among female students. Those charts on the right also show a really sharp increase in things like feelings of sadness and hopelessness, things like active suicidal ideation, just within the last couple of years. So, for instance, if you have a class of 20 high schoolers, this means that about 6 to 7 of them are experiencing poor mental health, and probably 2 or 3 that are struggling with suicidal thoughts in one way or another. This fits with other data that's been collected in recent years. Here, for example, another chart that you probably can't see, but that's okay, is another report from Clarify Health Institute, and that this is measuring the utilization of acute mental health care services over the past 5 years. And what you see, again, is a steady progression and then a real sharp upturn within the last couple of years. That map there, interestingly enough, shows the increase by region. It showed that New England had a 100% increase in utilization of mental health care among adolescents within the past 5 years. Now, we don't necessarily need this data to tell us that something is troubling that's happening in the lives of youth and families right now. It fits with most of our direct experience in our observations. I know at Harbor, we've seen requests for services for adolescents jump exponentially in the last couple of years for issues that are sometimes unclear and hard to diagnose. Parents or schools not quite sure what's going on with a young person. Sometimes they're for quite normal issues that they might be going through during that time of their life, and sometimes, unfortunately, they're very high risk and very acute issues. We've seen that same jump, by the way, with requests for family counseling, and a lot of times that is parents feeling very worn down and at a loss for what to do, and sometimes at odds with each other as a result. Now, I'm going to guess that most of you have noticed the same concerns yourself in your own church and community context to one degree or another. And maybe they're affecting you in your own homes, your own families, your own extended families as well. It's clear that something troubling is happening in the lives of youth and families right now on a broad social scale, but also right in front of us with people that we care really deeply about. So our aim today is twofold. First, I want to unpack the nature of this crisis and try to understand a little bit more about how and why we got here. And then second, I want to suggest 3 ways that the church, that your church, this network of churches even, can be a place of refuge in the midst of a crisis like this. So we're going to start by asking how we got here, and start there. So there's going to be 3 angles that I want to name here. Hopefully you can see these a little bit more, but if you can't, we have a way that you can download the slides afterwards if you'd like. There's also not a lot of information on the slides, so you just got to listen to me. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that this is something that happened gradually and then suddenly. You might recognize that as a quote from actually Ernest Hemingway, talking about what it was like to go into bankruptcy. He said it happened gradually and then suddenly. But it applies here as well. This crisis is not simply the result of the pandemic. It was definitely massively impacted by the pandemic and accelerated by the pandemic, but the roots were forming well before the pandemic took hold in our lives. Teen mental health issues and family challenges were on the rise, as many as 10 to 15 years ago, really. And then the pandemic came in, and what it did is disrupted a lot of the outlets and the supports that were typically in place to help with these types of issues. And it added a really heavy dose of stress and change and tension and collective trauma into the system that kind of sent it in that upward spike like that. But this has been forming gradually. The second characteristic to note is that this crisis is multi-factored, and what I mean by that is that it emerged out of a wide range of factors in combination with each other. It's not just one or two things. A lot of times we like to say, this is happening because of this reason, or this is happening because of that reason, but really it's a combination of a lot of different factors. So what are some of those factors? I'll just name a couple quickly that I think have played into it. One is just an increasing degree of isolation and desocialization in the lives of young people. So they're spending less and less time with each other outside of their homes and outside of school. They might be connected, but it's less time spent together, and so there's a great growing feeling of isolation and loneliness. A second thing, which is certainly related, is the prevalence of social media. And at this point, it's pretty much been proven that social media has a harmful effect on especially adolescent mental health. But it's also extremely in the air around us and hard to avoid. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and she asked me yesterday what TikTok is. And I was like, oh no, not ready for that. A third factor would be cultural polarization. So this is something we've heard a lot about, but what's the effect of this on young people? They're surrounded by conflict. They're surrounded by people at odds with each other and unable to get along. There's a growing sort of form of existential fears that young people are experiencing. So existential in the sense of like overwhelming, catastrophic types of fears. So fears about climate change, for instance, or fears about violence or war or illness from during the pandemic or economic stability. Lots of just very scary life kind of fears. For adolescents, of course, identity is always in flux. That's been true for long before all this, but I think some of the changing norms around how we think about identity just influences some of the confusion that's felt around that and some of the uncertainty in that identity process. And then the last thing I would name is just changes in parenting style. This is something that's been part of the research, but we have more well-intentioned parents today that are kind of showing an over-involvement or a way of removing stressors from the lives of their kids, which is well-intentioned, but it has a counterproductive effect of decreasing their ability to build resilience and stress tolerance. So those are all factors, and if you read through those, if you hear me list those out, what we see is that, again, this is something, these are all there, have been there for a while now, but definitely have seen a spike in the last couple of years as far as their prevalence in our world. One other thing I just want to add to this is, I think, the role of mental health awareness. Now, you would think as a counselor, I love mental health awareness, and of course I do. It's done a lot of good things, I think. It's great that people are paying attention to these issues and providing treatment more regularly now versus overlooking them or stigmatizing them. But I think there also is an element in which some youth can become, especially youth, can become preoccupied with mental health, or a lot of sort of self-diagnosing from what they hear people talking about, and what they hear around them, social media, a lot of that kind of thing happening. And again, I think that is happening with a lot of confusion around it and a lot of distress that comes along with it. So mental health awareness is one of those things that overall I love that it's happening, but there's some difficult ways in which it's taking shape. And then the third thing that I want to name here is just that we are also incredibly interrelated with one another. So that when one person struggles, others are affected by their struggle and then begin to experience their own struggles as a consequence, and so on from one person to the next. So in other words, the challenges faced by youth profoundly affect families and couples, and the opposite is true as well. The challenges faced by adults have this unmistakable effect on youth. Now that sounds obvious to say, I know that, but this adds a lot of complexity to a crisis like this, especially to trying to untangle it all. So let me just give you a hypothetical example of how this might work, drawn from a couple of real-life experiences. So let's imagine that two parents are struggling to know how to care for the well-being and safety of their 8th grade son, who has been depressed and missing school and has expressed suicidal thoughts on multiple occasions. The parents have missed work, had to pay large hospital bills, they've sacrificed nights of sleep, They've searched endlessly for a therapist who would fit their son's needs, all for months on end, and have found their own anxiety surging as a result, but have no capacity to do anything for themselves. Meanwhile, their two younger children have had to adjust to less regular attention from their parents and lack of consistent routines in their home because of the ups and downs of the past 2 years. So one is starting to act out behaviorally at school, but so far nothing serious because it's just early elementary school. And the other is feeling worried and sad, but keeping it inside because they know that mom and dad can't take any more burdens. Over time, these parents become worn down by the fact that they keep coming up against the same obstacles with their 8th grader and begin to resent the fact that one parent tends to be more lenient while the other tends to be more disciplinarian, or one tends to be more hands-on while the other tends to think they should not rush to get involved. And the fact that these challenges are there is evidence of the fact that they're right and the other person's wrong. They have no time or energy or desire to give to one another in their marriage, and as a result, their relationship starts to fray. And of course, this is all observed by the 3 kids and becomes added onto the range of stressors that they're carrying in their young, developing, impressionable minds. So add to this the fact that the 8th grader started middle school during the pandemic and all the disruptions of social life that happened with that. And now they're observing their peers in person and online expressing all manner of volatile feelings and weighty concerns, sometimes jokingly, sometimes with a lot of desperation behind it. And they've struggled to settle in with their peers at school because they're in and out of school all the time due to mental health issues. He's affected by his peers and his family and his peers are affected by him. And so it goes from one person to the next. It's truly incredible how interrelated we all are. It's beautiful, really, but also can sort of feel like falling dominoes at times. We're connected to one another in ways that can provide help, but also can cause harm. In our greatest struggles, we're never unaffected by other people in our life, especially those closest to us. But in order to work through those struggles, we're never able to get anywhere without the care and support and influence of other people, especially those closest to us. Of course, I can't help but think about how this mirrors the design that God intended for us in Genesis, as well as the dynamics of the fall and its consequences afterward. This all shows this interrelatedness. We're formed together, and then we fall apart together. I also think of the bodily metaphor for the church with many parts bound together with the head is Christ that we see in Romans and 1 Corinthians. So we're meant to function together, and that's in both joy as well as in hardship. Now, speaking of the church, I would argue that the church is very much caught up in this system of interrelatedness as well, isn't it? Sam spoke to this, how it's affecting churches. Things that are happening on the whole affect each of the parts within the church, and the things that are happening in the lives of the individual parts affects the whole. So more to the point, the crisis that's affecting families and youth has a tremendous impact on the life of the church. I know that it does. This is obvious to you, I'm sure. You're on the front lines, and you're experiencing this firsthand in one form or another in your own congregations. Now, I shared a survey with the registration email for this event to get a sense for what this group is carrying into our time together, and I'm really grateful to those of you who took the time to share your thoughts. And it's clear that your churches and you as church leaders are impacted by these issues. And I noticed a couple themes in the responses that you shared that I wanted just to highlight here. So clearly, mental health issues are a matter of pastoral concern. Some of you shared about fraying family and marital relationships within your church. You talked about young people navigating peer pressure and school-related challenges. Others within your churches that are struggling with severe depression, addictions, abuse, and several comments about grief and death and loss of loved ones, So beloved members of your flock are hurt or lost or afraid, and they're in need of care and shepherding. They may look to you for this, they may not, but in any case, I can tell that you all recognize, rightly so, you recognize a sense of pastoral responsibility for their spiritual well-being, if not also their mental and emotional well-being. It's a matter of pastoral concern. Mental health issues, especially those on the crisis level, are not only a pastoral level of concern, though. They're also a significant source of pastoral stress. That came through in your responses as well. Several of you described how time-consuming and energy-depleting these issues can become, how the volume and scope and complexity of these needs exceeds what you feel like you can provide, how you're maybe at a loss for where to look for support from mental health providers. It's incredibly stressful to feel responsible, but also might say powerless, or at least outside of your capacity with things like this. All meanwhile, while having to attend to the welfare of the rest of the congregation as well. It's incredibly stressful. Beyond the impact on the life and ministry of the church leader, though, there's also a ripple effect within the congregation when a crisis is occurring, right? We talked about this idea of interrelatedness earlier, and this is where this shows up for a church. Several of you described experiences of conflict, division, resentment, frustration that have grown as a result of crises like this. And let's be honest, people in crisis may be sometimes easy to have compassion for, but is that always the case? I don't think it is, no. In many cases, they are actually very difficult to be around. There's a sense of chaos or irregularity that comes with them. There's a disruptiveness, definitely a neediness, and it's hard to pin down what they're really needing or what's going on for them. Maybe they're reluctant to share, maybe even resistance towards your efforts to help. And this can create discomfort, this can create tension in a congregation. It might distract from worship, discipleship, other functions of the church. Or it could also bring similar crises kind of out of the woodwork, similar struggles out of the woodwork, to where it becomes quite overwhelming. So there's a ripple effect. We are all very, very interrelated. Now, lastly, it seems that one of the particularly challenging aspects of crisis within the church context is disengagement from the church. So many described the difficulty of people disengaging from the life of the church during a crisis or as a result of the crisis. People walking away, people not showing up, people pulling back when you're reaching out. Others described how difficult it can just be to engage, to get through, to see people want to receive the help. And let me be clear that there are going to be lots of cases where there's nothing you can do to control that, to control somebody pulling away or refusing to receive help. I'll tell you, we as counselors experience this all the time, that there is a limit to what you can do, but it's incredibly difficult and stressful and frustrating within the church to see that disengagement happening and not know what to do with it. Because how can we help when people are not around, right? Or how can we help when they're not open to receiving help? So, that sounds like a crisis, right? That's tough. It is very overwhelming and very discouraging. It's a recipe for pastoral burnout, too, a lot of times, the cumulative effect of all that. So it sounds like a crisis, but in our line of work, we are often talking about crises of different kinds. And, I always want to highlight an essential truth about a crisis. I believe a crisis, in almost every case, is meant to serve a purpose. A crisis calls for our attention and signals a need for change. It shows us that something's not quite working, the pieces aren't quite fitting together the way they need to. needs of the situation outpace the resources or the training or the responses that we've been giving to it. If I think about my raccoon crisis again, there's raccoons in the backyard and I don't know what to do about it, so I got to figure it out. A crisis calls for our attention and it signals a need for change. So, as a church, what are we supposed to do with that? So in the time that we have left this morning, I want to, again, suggest 3 ways that the church can be a refuge and a resource to people in crisis, particularly to youth and families in crisis. So these are 3 truths, maybe we want to call them, that the church must embody to do this. So the first is that the church must be a place where it's okay to be in crisis. That tiny text that you can't read there, it's from Matthew 11, and it's Jesus' invitation, which reads, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." If we think about just the example of Jesus, the person that he was pursuing and preferring almost to be around were people that looked more like people in crisis than people that had it all together, right? That was true for his followers, it's true for his disciples in ways as well. Jesus sought out people in crisis, and it was okay for them to be around him. We must be like Jesus in this way. The church must be a place where it's okay to be part of the community, to be respected and dignified and welcomed without judgment, even in our moments of greatest distress. Of course, we think it's okay. We think it is okay. We say, "Come as you are." We say, the church is for broken people, right? But is it really? Think about that. Is it really? When you're truly a broken person, is that really how it feels to be in church? To me, this is much less about the things that we say, excuse me, and much more about the things that we do, how we react to somebody in crisis, and even how we look at one another during crisis. So I think of a family, and these again are hypothetical stories taken from real life experiences. But I think of a family with a 12-year-old son with really intense behavioral issues, very disruptive, and significant mood issues that go along with it. And every Sunday is an absolute struggle for them to be at church with him. And it feels to them like everybody in the church is watching them and speculating about what's going on and bothered by it all. And they go home from church more upset and exhausted by one another. And honestly, it just makes everything feel a lot worse. I think of a woman in her early 20s with really extensive trauma history who had a series of conflicts with others in the church that were very much related to some of her trauma history. And she's acknowledged this and sought support. But frequently what she's found, somewhat from church leaders, but also from others in the church, that the church is more concerned with the trouble that she's causing than the pain that she's experiencing. I think of also a high school student struggling with deep depression and suicidal ideation, who's brought to church and sees adults not really talking about these kinds of hardships as part of the faith, and she goes to her youth group and gets the sense that everybody's supposed to feel happy all the time as a Christian, and she starts to wonder, what's wrong with me? And maybe this isn't a place for me. Clearly, in these cases at least, the church is not always a place where it feels okay to be in crisis. Thankfully, this is not always the case, though. And so, to contrast that, I want to share a few examples of ways that we've seen churches do this really well. These are churches that maybe speak openly and regularly about mental health, whether in preaching illustrations, talking about mental health, in Bible study discussions, in small group conversations, even in the sharing of testimonies and life stories. For youth, we might think of churches that engage their youth in talking about mental health openly as a part of the Christian life in a thoughtful way, and not leaving it as something that belongs somewhere else. For what it's worth, I noticed showing up here this morning that there's a rack of brochures there in the lobby that is about counseling needs and mental health issues. That's a great example of something that signals that it's okay to be in crisis here. It's okay to be experiencing these things that you might see on the wall and be here at church. So that's a great example of this. I think this serves to normalize the reality of mental health and to contextualize it as something that happens within the range of normal experience for Christians, and it's just part of being a human. There are also churches that maybe have a really clear path for seeking support when someone's in crisis, whether that's a teenager or a family or otherwise. That might look like having a designated point person within the church who can be sought out to help facilitate finding support, or even providing some level of pastoral care. There's another church, I think within this same network actually, that we've worked with before, that has a really great section on their website with an extensive list of counseling and mental health resources. And that's not just counselors to contact, it's also like really thoughtful articles and books related to mental health. And it's right up front, very easy to find anytime somebody goes to the website, because sometimes people are going to look in more backdoor sorts of ways than ask directly for help. And again, having a clear path for somebody to seek out help, I think, again, shows that we as a church expect this to be a need for anyone and everyone at any given time. And that supporting those needs is an integral part of the way that the church cares for one another. In each of these cases, the church is communicating loudly and clearly that you belong here, whether you're in crisis or not, that we're ready to receive you, we do not judge you, and we want to come alongside you and just be with you in this. By the way, I think this also helps to some degree with that disengagement issue. When a person feels that kind of a thing, they're more likely to, I believe, stay engaged. Secondly, the church must be a place that is characterized by healthy relationships. Tiny text here. What did Jesus tell his disciples in John 13? Jesus spoke this. He said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this, all people will know you are my disciples." How? By your great preaching, by your clean buildings, by your quiet worship services. No, he said, by this, all people will know you're my disciples if you have love for one another. If we look again at the way we describe the mental health crisis, all those different factors that we talked about earlier, isolation, desocialization, social media issues, cultural polarization, existential fears, identity changes, parenting styles, the interrelatedness of it all. I see a problem of relationships across the board. I see distressed relationships, disrupted relationships, lacking relationships, harmful relationships, insecure relationships, misunderstanding about relationships. So as much as I said I don't want to reduce this issue to any one thing, I think relationships are a clear underlying need here within this crisis. And coincidentally, it's a place where the church can really enter into the picture in providing a resource. After all, our Savior has highlighted love for one another as the distinctive trait of being his disciples. So it ought to be in our lifeblood, right? The catch is that we're not always very skilled at relationships, or at least certain parts of relationships within the church. In some cases, we're downright bad at them, or negligent or misguided when it comes to relationships. Why is that? The biggest reason is that we're all sinners and we're all human as well, and people are difficult sometimes. But it can be for a lot of other things. It can be a focus on program over people within a church. It can be unresolved conflict that kind of festers within the church, and we don't really quite know what to do with that or how to resolve it. It could be a need to keep up appearances or keep people happy, keep things running smoothly. It could be impatience, again, with the messiness and complexity and frustrations of broken people. And it could also be a leader burnout, too. Again, it's just really hard to keep caring well when you're in a space of burnout. But whatever the reasons, we need to reset on this. The church must be a place that's characterized by healthy relationships. In other words, the church must unmistakably care about prioritizing, building, understanding, repairing when needed, and enjoying healthy relationships in our life. So I keep using this phrase, healthy relationships. Let's take a quick pause on that. It sounds a little fuzzy, sounds a little counselor-y. So I just want to highlight two things that I mean by that. The first is within healthy relationships, we might be thinking about the experience of intimacy and security. In more plain terms, we might say being known. So that's demonstrating a sense of openness, vulnerability, understanding, empathy. People are there and feel like they are known by others, and they can be known by others. With that also just a sense of being inherently valued, no matter who you are or where you're at in your life, not being more or less based on that. And also a sense of belonging within the relationship. So this is a place that is for me. And then second, with healthy relationships, we think of the experience of interdependence. Confusing word, but basically means a balance of a unity and distinction within the relationship. So togetherness and separateness between the collective and the individual, right? And really, boundaries are the biggest indicator of that healthy interdependence. So where there's a straying from that towards the extremes of unity or distinction, togetherness, separateness, that might look like codependence or enmeshment or having to fit a certain mold. I was with my cousin, actually yesterday, who's lives in Texas, where I'm from, and he was sharing with me about a church that he used to be a part of that specifically not just discouraged mental health care, but forbid it within their congregation, because everything that a person might have to talk about needs to be shared with a pastor or with a small group leader only, and it must be resolved within there. So that to me sounds like the codependence enmeshment piece. It all is held within. On the other hand, on the other end of it, there's maybe a sense of disinterest or disconnection or unfamiliarity. So there's an aloofness there. We don't really know what's going on with each other. So intimacy and security, interdependence. By the way, as theologians, we're all theologians, right? We can recognize that these two categories of relationship are being ultimately modeled by the interrelationship between the three persons of the Trinity. Intimacy and security, as well as interdependence, right? I can't give my full treatise on Trinitarian theology, but we can chat later about it if you're interested. But I think it's really cool to see that that's the basis for this kind of thing. All right, so let's get practical about this. How can the church be a place that is characterized by healthy relationships? Well, I would suggest that it starts with you all. Or at least it starts with leadership in the church. And here's what I mean. Pastoral relationships, mentoring relationships, elder relationships, group leader relationships, ministry leader relationships, relationships among church staff or church leaders. When those formal roles, those formal relationships have a primarily relational focus, where the relationship, the quality of the relationship is prioritized. Typically, there is a culture formed as a result of that, in which informal, organic, reciprocated, healthy relationships are formed in the church as a result. So I think there's often a direct flow between what relationships look like among leadership to how the culture of the church is formed there. That does not mean you have to be a charismatic leader or have great people skills. It definitely doesn't mean you need to be an extrovert. Most counselors are not extroverts, and I think most pastors are not extroverts, actually. I think it just means you ultimately need to make an effort. I don't know if there's any basketball fans here, but they say defense in basketball, the difference between poor and passing is usually just a matter of effort. So if you have any Celtics fans, it was a little too close for our comfort there. They had these two games, I think, where they just forgot to play defense. When they remember to play defense, when they make an effort, they prioritize it, it makes all the difference. I think it's like this too when it comes to relationships. It's just a matter of making an effort and prioritizing it and remembering to do that. I might also just highlight churches that orient ministries and discipleship initiatives around regular forms of sharing life together. So that can look like sharing meals, gathering in homes, social activities, helping ministries, play groups, parent nights out, practical service. These are all examples of sharing life together, and our ministries and our discipleship efforts are very much centered around this. It's a big part of what we do. For anybody that works in youth or with youth, you know that this is especially true for them. Being in their life, sharing life together, going to their things, and finding ways for them to be together doing the things that they enjoy has an incredible impact towards developing a sense of belonging, feeling like they're known, feeling like they're valued. Before I was in counseling, I was actually a youth pastor for several years. And we had a volunteer on our team that had a student in their group that was really on the fringes. And clearly, I didn't have enough insight at the time to know what was going on, but clearly had some mental health challenges going on in his life. But something that was really important to him was robotics, and he was in a robotics club. This volunteer drove to a robotics competition that was 2 hours away from where we lived and where the church was. Hundreds of kids, only knew one kid there, and was only there for the one kid. And that effort was not very efficient, not a great use of time, actually. But that made a huge difference in the life of that kid. And he felt, as a result, more connected, more known, more valued because of the effort to be in his life in that way. This is true for youth. I think it's true for adults, too. So it's important to be in their lives and to share life together. When I was in seminary, we had to read a book by a 17th century Puritan English minister named Richard Baxter called The Reformed Pastor. Has anybody ever read that book? Awesome, yeah. He talked about the importance of visitation, of a minister visiting the homes of each person in their flock. Now, he lived in a village in the 17th century, so his world was a little different. But the principle is worth noting, I think. And here's what he said about the value of visitation, of going into people's homes. He said, "We shall come to be better acquainted with each person's spiritual state, and so the better know how to watch over them. We shall know better how to preach to them and carry ourselves to them when we know their temper. We shall know better how to lament for them and to rejoice with them and to pray for them." And that's really what we're talking about here, is having that kind of intimate knowledge and connection with them. One last example, maybe, is just churches that provide support groups for couples, for parents, even for teenagers. There may be some teaching around that, but also it's mostly a place to connect and to receive kind of openness and empathy. So just a quick example about that. We were asked a couple years ago to facilitate a parent support group for a church not too far from here, specifically for parents who had kids with difficult mental health issues going on in their life. And The parents that were able to come, the biggest thing that they expressed in that support group is what an incredible experience it was to be in a room with other parents who could understand what they were going through. And that apart from that, they had this sense that I'm the only one. We're the only ones. We're the only people that are having to face challenges like this, and feeling very isolated as a result. And which, as they saw by coming together, was not the case. That they are not alone. That there's support for that, and that we as a church are here to help provide that. If the church can be a resource for relationships and a place for people to experience and learn and grow about relational health, not be perfect people, but really be seriously committed to that, then I think people that are in desperate need of that, as we talked about, people who are struggling without that type of relationship health in their life, people who are trying to navigate a world that feels relationally disoriented, I think that they can find a place to belong, a place to feel inherently valued, a place to feel known. And the last thing, and I'm going to be too brief on this, but we can talk more later about it. The last thing I just want to name is that in order to be a place of refuge for people in crisis, I would suggest that the church also must be a place that partners with other care providers. The reason for this is because, as you probably know, the needs will inevitably reach beyond the scope of time or energy or training or fit of the church, and so we need to have partnerships when that inevitably happens. It's not just that church leaders can't do it all, but in a lot of cases they really shouldn't do it all when we're talking about mental health crises. And this is, of course, particularly the case when the needs are very persistent or complex or acute, severe, and definitely when there are matters of safety, high risk, significant trauma, or abuse involved. It's not just that the church can't do it all alone. They really shouldn't in those cases. So when this is the case, the church really needs trusted partners. And again, I think when these partnerships are there, it sends this important message that mental health is normal and expected and cared for within the community of the church, not something that does not belong here. I know this is hard, especially right now in most places. It's hard to know where to find help. It's especially hard for folks that are in more remote places, and maybe that's true for a lot of you. And we can definitely discuss more about that, either during our time of questions later. If you want to chat after we're done, we can do that. Harbor itself would love to be a resource to you all in that. Now, I know we can't do it all, nor do we need to, because there's lots of great care providers out there. But as I said earlier, that's a big part of what we strive to do, is to be a partner to churches, both to build up and encourage and train church leaders, but also to be a counseling resource to them whenever we can. A couple more just quick sort of ideas around this, what this could look like in different places. You might have a referral list of counselors that you've had contact with. If you don't, though, you might reach out to other churches in your area and just ask them, do you have a referral list? This is a great way for churches to work together to try to figure out how can we handle these types of needs. Telehealth, which is remote counseling, video counseling, has become a much more normal thing, especially as a necessary thing during the pandemic. But I would say overall, we've been really surprised as a staff about the quality of care that we're still able to provide through telehealth. And the benefit of it is it widely expands the accessibility for people. So being able to find a counselor anywhere within your state, that's a good fit for you, especially for Christian counselors. Telehealth opens a lot of doors, and I think takes a lot less away from the table than a lot of people might assume that it does. It can be really, really great quality of care there. In some cases, I would just say too, it's totally appropriate to consider engaging non-Christian counselors to a degree, and that's, I think, especially true for crisis level types of needs, because I'll tell you, like, the things that we as Christian counselors would do in the midst of a crisis are very similar to what a non-Christian counselor would do in the midst of a crisis, because it's really fundamentally about stabilizing, making sure people are safe, helping to get them to the next step. Maybe when it gets into the more deeper level issues of that, then we might see some of the differences coming out between Christian and non-Christian counselors. But I just want to put in a word that we don't necessarily need to be totally afraid to engage non-Christian counselors. And there are other community resources, and we have a list of resources that can be helpful to churches. That's at the end of the slides here. It's also on our website, and we'd be glad to share those with you. Now, what did Jesus say that we talked about earlier? He said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened." When we see families and youth in crisis, let's remember that the church is meant for people just like this. It's meant for times of need just like this. The church is a place where it must be and can be and often is okay to be in crisis. The church is a place that is characterized, meant to be characterized, and often is characterized by healthy relationships. So let us love one another as Christ first loved us. Let's be a refuge and a resource to those in need of this very thing. Heavenly Father, thank you for the faithfulness of these churches and those who are here representing them and leading them today, Lord. Lord, we need your help. We need your Holy Spirit. We need your encouragement. We need your strength to care well for these types of needs, Lord. And we pray that the things that we have reflected on today would be fruitful towards that end, Lord. I pray that they would take root in our hearts and produce a greater sense of capacity and readiness and care for these types of needs in your church, Lord. We pray all of this in Christ's name. Amen.